Hello and welcome to the AP World History Podcast. This is episode 12, Tropical Asia and Africa. This week's podcast will focus on the post-classical civilizations in the tropical zone. So the tropical zone is the region in between the Tropic of Cancer in the north and the Tropic of Capricorn in the south, with the equator in the middle. So much of the Indian subcontinent lies in the tropics, all of the civilizations of Southeast Asia, and almost the entire continent of Africa. So I'll talk briefly about all three in today's podcast, starting with the Indian subcontinent, then Southeast Asia, and finally Africa. So one of the major course themes is cross-cultural interaction. So that's a very general term for the spreading of ideas, the spreading of technologies, spreading of religions, spreading of political systems, spreading of diseases, and so on between cultures. So throughout world history, innovations happen much more through interaction than through isolation. So still thinking big picture, there's really two major ways that cultures come to interact with each other. The first is through invasion or military conquest, and the second is, of course, through trade. So we'll start off with India. In the classical period, there's a powerful dynasty in India known as the Gupta. And when the Gupta Empire fell apart, India broke into a period of political disunity. So I'm sure this sounds familiar. We looked at Europe, Western Europe, the Dark Ages in Western Europe, China and the Warring States period in China. So lots of small kingdoms in northern India, and all these kingdoms are in a state of constant warfare with each other, and this war lasted until the formation of the Mughal dynasty in the 16th century. So in episode 10, we looked at the rise of Islam and the spreading of Islam, and during the post-classical period, Islam would come to India and have a big impact on Indian civilization. So the ultimate question was, could Islam and Hinduism coexist alongside each other? So you have religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. These religions have a lot in common. Hinduism's very different, so you have a conflict with strict belief in just one god in Islam, and belief of many gods in Hinduism. And in 1947, when India gained independence from Great Britain, ultimately the answer was no, these two religions could not coexist with each other in one country, and India was divided into two separate countries, Pakistan for Muslims and India for Hindus. Okay, so how did Islam arrive in India? Religion, like all other cross-cultural interactions, it's usually spread through military conquest or through trade, and both of these happened in India. In terms of conquest, from very early on, Arab forces from the west conquered parts of northwest India, so this was happening by the 700s. But more significant, what you need to know about are the people who invaded from Central Asia to the north and who established the Delhi Sultanate based out of Delhi in India. So the first king or sultan of the Delhi Sultanate was Iltutmish, who by the year 1206 had created a large Muslim kingdom in northern India. And Iltutmish gained recognition of the Delhi Sultanate as a Muslim state by the Caliph of Baghdad. Before he died, Iltutmish decided that he wanted his daughter, Razia, to be his heir because he didn't really trust his sons. His sons were kind of incompetent. At first this wasn't allowed, and one of his sons was made the Sultan, but after just a couple months of incompetent rule, ministers in the Sultanate decided that they would give Razia a chance, and she was a very effective ruler, but was eventually overthrown by men who just couldn't accept a female ruler. So the Delhi Sultanate stayed in power for about 200 years, but in the year 1398, Delhi was sacked by Mongols, which started the end of the Sultanate. But the historical significance is that this firmly established Islam in northern India. So, on top of military conquest, Islam also came to India through trade. This is especially true in southern India, where the coastal regions of India welcomed Islamic merchants, and Islamic communities developed along the coast of southern India, and all the southern Indian Hindu kingdoms encouraged and tolerated Muslim traders. Okay, so just moving on, I want to address agriculture, trade, and religion in India during the post-classical period. A big picture concept that you need to get in order to understand India is the concept of monsoons. So here in Canada, we have 4 distinct seasons, and our seasons are distinguished by the temperature. When we think of India or Africa or Southeast Asia, it's better to think of the seasons as the dry season and the wet season. So, the dry and wet season are caused by alternating winds that are known as monsoons. And between April and August, a low pressure zone carries wind off of the Indian Ocean. This is known as the southwest monsoon because the winds are coming from the southwest off of the Indian Ocean and pushing towards the northeast. And this monsoon brings heavy rain all over southern Asia. The other monsoon is the northeast monsoon, which originates in a giant high-pressure zone over the Himalayas. And these winds blow in from the northeast and create a dry season from December to March. So this is like cold air blowing in from the mountains that leaves the land dry. So agriculture depended on building large dams, building reservoirs for water during the dry season so that farmers could continue to grow food during the dry season. As farmers became more and more efficient at growing the staple crops such as rice, barley, millet, and wheat, the population expanded and more people were able to pursue work in other areas. So when all these conditions are in place, a population that can be adequately fed can lead to population growth and specialized workers. Specialized workers create stuff that can be traded for other stuff. So in episode 7, we looked at the concept of the sea roads and how India was right in the middle of a great trading network, and it could, trade with the powers in Arabia, it could trade with powers in East Asia, China, Southeast Asia. So it was this prime location in the Indian Ocean basin that provided much of India's wealth. So monsoons are important to understanding agriculture, but also to understanding trade in the Indian Ocean basin. So Indian sailors developed an understanding of the monsoons very early, and they used the monsoons to make long-distance trade possible. And it wasn't just Indian sailors that knew this, but their trading partners as well. So whether they were Persians or Arabs or Chinese or Malays, they all took advantage of the monsoon winds. So in the dry season, when the winds were coming from the northwest, Arab and Persian sailors would leave ports and sail towards trading ports in India with their boats loaded with goods from the Middle East, loaded with goods from East Africa. So here we have pictured a dhow, which is a typical boat that people from Arabia or people from Persia would take to India. So now, during the dry season, even larger ships from China and Malaysia would be sailing away from India and back to China. Then during the next wet season, the Arab and Persian merchants would sail back with their ships full of Indian goods, and the Chinese and Malaysian ships would make another trip to India. So they would just rely on the wind to carry them along the trade route. So pictured here is a typical Chinese boat known as a junk. Okay, so here's just a quick overview of some of the things that were traded in the Indian Ocean trade. So from India, cotton was big, steel, leather tanning, China, silk, of course, porcelain, the Middle East, horses, dates and nuts, incense, and from East Africa, ivory, gold, even slaves, and the goods from East Africa. This was via Arab traders. So we saw how, with the Delhi Sultanate, Islam came to northern India through conquest. But now we see, especially in southern India, Islam coming to India through trade. And in southern India, Islam was at first really only practiced in the cosmopolitan cities along the coast that participated directly in the trade. And outside, it was still regarded as a foreign religion or a conqueror's religion. But gradually, Indian people began converting to Islam, And probably the biggest reason for this is Islam's message of equality versus the Hindu caste system. So we see conversion from Hinduism to Islam being done not so much at the level of the individual, but entire villages and communities or entire castes converting to Islam in an effort to improve their social standing. And again, Hinduism remained popular, so this isn't everybody, but some people did convert to Islam. There is even an effort to blend Hinduism and Islam together into one new religion. The Bhakti movement encouraged Hindu traditions, but the belief in one God and the elimination of the caste system or the equality that was found in Islam. So I believe we've looked at the word syncretism, which is a movement to blend two belief systems together. So the Bhakti movement would be an example of a syncretic movement because it's blending together Hinduism and Islam.